Lawyers, at what point when working for a defendant did you realize my client is a monster? Content warning. These stories contain discussion of abuse, S assault, violence, and R of both adults and minors. Story 1. Criminal defense lawyer. I can name a few instances where I was just absolutely disgusted with my client. Caveat, these are mostly years ago when I was taking just any old case. I must practice white collar and federal now. 1. I won a DUI case because the government messed up on something right before trial was to begin. My client gives me a big hug and completely reeks of alcohol. He was driven to court. I took his keys and called his mother. 2. Client who was accused of molesting a 12-year-old. He was mid-40s at the time, and I had to shut him down real quick when he tried to tell me how the 12-year-old was coming on to him. 3. I represented a woman for a grand theft charge, left her in my office to get some things copied before she left. After she left, I realized my sunglasses and car keys were stolen. I tracked her down in the lobby and told her I was not going to represent her anymore and I would call the police if she didn't empty her pockets in front of me and give me my things. 4. I had a client who was released after 25 years in prison for murder, and then the same day he beat up his prospective new landlord. He ended up getting another 10 years. He was unrepentant and laughed about how he hit the guy so hard his eyeball popped out. I thought, this guy deserves to be in prison. Took the case to trial anyway, and shocker, lost, and he got 10, the max. 5. Client who pretended to be a doctor so he could sell steroids. According to the government, he had numerous clients who were made to believe that his steroids would cure their cancer. They paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars, and some of them died. I just thought that was pure evil. Clearly, we're going to be reading about some pretty awful humans, and I know folks are going to wonder why these lawyers would represent them. All I know is representation is an important right, but honestly I'm not smart enough about lawyer stuff to give any good opinions on it. I believe the fact that I called it lawyer stuff proves my point. Story 2. Like always, not exactly the answer to the specific question, but I doubt you're going to have legitimate lawyers perusing this site and telling you about their cases. Seems like a very fine line of confidentiality to walk to tell internet strangers about things that happened in the courtroom, so I'll give my story. My ex-aunt has been through about 10 lawyer teams in what's going on an 8-year lasting custody battle. And we're not exactly in a place where there's that many lawyers. Her last and final group she literally had to hire from another state because word has gone out in the legal community to not ruin your career associating with this woman. She has filed every CPS, CYS type of injunction accusing our entire family of R and molestation to draw this out as long as possible. On my side, the one case that got brought up in court was that I had R'd my then what would have been 8-year-old cousin while I was studying abroad, literally on the exact opposite side of the planet. Obviously, CYS can't just ignore a claim like that, but when it finally got to a judge after these accusations and he realized, wait, this kid wasn't within thousands of miles of the child in about a year from when this supposedly happened, he brought her and her then lawyer up with contempt charges. I'm just vaguely describing it all. It gets way deeper and more effed up. Thankfully, once a kid is 14, they get way more rights as far as court proceedings go, so he can finally tell the judge he wants nothing to do with his mom unless it's by his terms. Story 3. My mom's lawyer, and when I asked her the worst case she ever dealt with, she told me this. When I was a new attorney, I was working for a company and they gave me a case in a black folder and said that no one was going to take it, so it was on me. When I looked into the folder, it was the most grisly, disgusting description of S assault of a child that I vomited into my trash can. I had to take it. Met the girl, very smart but terrified of everyone and everything. She told me how he hurt her every day and would climb in bed with her for special uncle time every night. The girl was 5. When offered one of the dolls to show where he touched her, she simply replied, everywhere. He had R'd her every single night for at least a year and molested her multiple times. It was also suspected that he brought his friends over and did it, but couldn't be confirmed. The girl broke down in court and couldn't stand as a witness. She couldn't testify. She was the only witness. The mother testified he wouldn't do anything, same with the father. I got to watch this man who I knew with everything in me hurt this child, buckle her into the car, and drive her away with the parents. It was disgusting. I will never forgive anyone in that jury for as long as I live, and I hope they rot in hell. I still don't know why some sort of psych or doctor was brought in or if one was brought in, but my mother won't talk about what happened in the courtroom. Clearly it was more disturbing than what you read above. My mother quit that job and began working for another company soon after in a different sector of law. I don't think I could be a lawyer and work a case like that without completely losing it. Like, I would never want this lawyer to blame herself for the outcome of that case, but I know I couldn't live with myself if someone got away with that when I was trying to stop it. Story 4. Civil defense here, so maybe not as juicy as the crime defense folks. Some of the work I do is employment defense, particularly S/age harassment/discrimination cases. I'm pretty cynical and see a lot of cases where plaintiffs are full of crap, particularly in harassment/discrimination cases. In one case, I was defending a company and that company's manager jointly. The manager seemed like a straight-up guy, and I pride myself in being a good judge of character. I was pretty convinced the case was just payback from a disgruntled employee. To my credit, the plaintiff, a 38-year-old female, was a really poor employee by all accounts. Still, it didn't prepare me from what I found doing a review of every email the company had stored on their servers. Not only did this guy stick his hand down this woman's shirt without consent, when she threatened to go to HR, he said he'd get her fired and make sure she never got a job again. The lady was a single mother with 3 kids. He also propositioned her for intercourse in exchange for a day off. He thought the email had been wiped because the company had 1-year retention policy. Apparently, some of the company's older emails remained on a server before the policy was put in place because of the migration of the emails from an older outsourced IT company. Not sure if my terminology is right here. I had to substitute out of the case thereafter for conflict reasons since my 2 clients' interests were no longer aligned. Story 5. My girlfriend was on the jury for a capital murder charge. He brutally arred and murdered a young mother and attempted to do the same to her toddler, who somehow, miraculously or not, depending on how you look at it, survived. The son grew up and was about 14 by the time that this case was brought forward to determine if the death penalty would be used. Obviously, the killer had already been in prison, was found guilty long ago, or if he would avoid the death penalty and spend 3 life sentences in prison. He had originally attacked several women before this incident and sent 2 to the hospital, but was released with a slap on the wrist after serving minimal jail time. The murder was preventable, but leniency let this violent man back out on the streets. What is sad is that every single witness for the defense was a member of his family, and every single one of them was caught lying under oath. Even over the most inconsequential things. It's as if the whole family, mother, father, brothers, and sisters, was physically incapable of saying anything truthful. None of them even showed any sympathy for the victims or even acknowledged that R and murder are wrong. The killer showed no remorse either. What was really chilling, however, was the fact that every woman that he attacked looked strikingly similar to my girlfriend, and he stared at her with a blank expression almost the entire time. It really freaked her out, and she still has nightmares about it. I'm sorry, but if a member of my family possibly committed these kinds of crimes, I would be as honest on the stand as possible, even if I thought something I knew could be used against them. I would never want a family member of mine to go free, but to question if they actually were guilty, but my lie prevented that from being found out. Shame on those people. Story 6. I was appointed to represent a Rist. He was charged with level 1 felony R, and it wasn't just any kind of R, but home invasion R at 5 a.m. It was a college town, and this random tramp was going around this apartment complex, checking doors, and found one that was unlocked. He goes in and gets on top of the victim and ties her to the bed, then Rs her with his penis and also her dildo from the bedside table. He comes on her labia and lower back and then dumps a bunch of water all over her while still tied up. Then he takes her phone and some other property and unties her and tells her not to move for 30 minutes and leave. I spent about 3 hours reading the case file and all the depositions of the witnesses. Afterward, I felt like I was going to vomit. I felt sick that I'd be spending my time and effort defending him. I have been assaulted more than once in my life, and the stuff from this case is essentially my worst nightmare. His defense, it was consensual, and they met outside of the bus stop at 3 a.m, and she told him he was a beast and invited him up to her place. When I went to visit him in jail for the first time, he said he had done some digging on the victim and found out she had a conviction for drunk driving. He asked if we could bring this in to discredit her. It was hard for me not to flash angry at this. It was at this point I told him to take the deal for 20 years because he'd get 80 years at trial with the evidence state had. Story 7. I got arrested when I was younger and wound up counting jail for a bit. When you first get transferred there from the police station holding, you end up seeing a judge who sets your bail. The whole thing is done from inside the jail and through a TV screen, so you never see the judge or your public defendant in person. It was my first time doing this whole thing, and I was sticking nearby this guy that went by Repo, who had been in and out of jail before. We're watching for our turn in front of the judge, and there's this kid ahead of us. They didn't really care much about privacy, so you could hear the whole thing if you were next in line. This was barely 18 years old, just like a week over, and he had a rap sheet that was extremely long. They get to the current charge that he was in there for, which was allegedly smacking a brick over the head of an elderly man and robbing him. I was very surprised by that, but I was even more surprised at how Repo reacted to this. Even though he had been in and out of the system for all sorts of crimes and had met a ton of other criminals, something like that was over the top for him, especially since this kid was so young. It was pretty sad to think that this kid's life was already that messed up at such a young age and was probably going to get worse from there. Story 8. I'm not a lawyer, but I have a pretty unnerving story anyways. I work as a police officer and got a call up about a mom and dad fighting. Dispatch, I believe that's what they call it in America, I don't work there, told me that the dad was drunk and was very aggressive. When we arrived, there was a little girl knocked out while her sister, hysterically crying, was trying to wake her up. The dad took the newborn and left the house, leaving the kid and the mom behind. Later, we found out that he killed the baby because he thought it was from another guy. It wasn't. He was just too drunk to understand it was his kid. I got to talk to the lawyer of the family, and she told me he had done some horrible things to them, like taping the kids to their chair and forcing them to drink alcohol. But the thing that struck me the most was the 911 call the 6-year-old kid made from the other room. It was the most horrible sound to hear her so scared, screaming if the police could please come. At the end of the call, you hear her dad entering the room, hitting and kicking her because she called the police. I had goosebumps all over my body and will never forget that call. Sorry for the long story, and excuse my English, it's not my native language. I want to believe in rehabilitation and stuff, but F that piece of crap. I hope he rots in jail the rest of his life. I hope he feels immense pain and regret for the rest of his miserable days. I'm sorry. Sorry. Story 9. Not for a defendant, but as a prosecutor at the state attorney's office in Miami. There was this 15-year-old Haitian kid when I was working in the juvenile division that still haunts me. I remember his face even now because he had 2 distinct tattoos on it with very bloodshot eyes. He was arrested after he ran into police chasing after a teenage girl with a Gatorade bottle. Turns out the girl worked at a gas station and had called the police a week earlier because the boy was sitting outside staring at her. He had come back a week later, walked into the store, and stole a Gatorade in front of her without a word, dumped it outside, pushed a patron away, and poured gasoline in the bottle. Then started walking back towards the attendant. She freaks out and starts running out the store. He comes in, gets a lighter, and starts chasing after her. He runs right into 2 patrol officers and gets arrested. Just looking at him in court freaked me out, which was unusual to say the least. He seemed completely dead inside, showed absolutely zero emotions, and didn't say a single word at any stage, even after sentencing. 5 years later, I was watching the first 48 and saw the Haitian kid's mugshot at the end with the same tattoos, arrested for home invasion and triple murder without motive in Miami. Story 11. I've done a lot of prison legal aid, and I could tell stories about child molesters that would turn you green, but instead I'll turn you green a different way. I had a kid, 17, who was mildly cognitively disabled due to brain trauma he sustained at the hands of his birth parents, who ended up with a really wonderful foster care family and thrived. He was a popular kid in school, good athlete, got a girlfriend, and invited her to meet up and be teenagers one night in a corn silo, which I guess is a thing that country kids do? I don't know. This all comes from the pre-sentence investigation report I read before taking his case, but this girl met him at the silo and they were hanging out inside. By his account, they were having a nice time and he was really enjoying himself. Then, for no particular reason, he picked up a 2x4 and bashed her skull in. He then used a combination of very crude farm implements, shovel, hose, to chop her body up and bury it in the corn and went home like nothing had happened. Hey, you asked. I'm not even sure what to say. Like, you want to blame the cognitive disability and brain trauma, but no, he killed someone and he has to be held accountable for that. That's just awful for that poor girl. Story 12. My worst client was a woman who was rude, aggressive, argumentative, paranoid, and she thought everyone was out to get her. She had a terminal illness and still acted like a total B. I represented her in 3 separate civil cases. She had gone through 2 lawyers already who dropped her. At one point, even the judge had talked to me in his chambers after a hearing to advise me on how to deal with her. Opposing counsel was present. I realized she was a monster when I had to present her for direct testimony and cross-examine before a different judge in a separate case, and she was probably one of the best witnesses I had ever presented. I had been mine. Surprisingly, she answered all the questions briefly and directly. She was empathetic, and she handled the cross-examination like a pro. I almost felt sorry for her. It was like she was a totally different person on the witness stand. The way she was able to act convincingly like a decent human being, knowing she was a bad person in real life, showed me how much of a psycho she was. Story 13. Not me, my dad. After he got client out of a double murder charge by insanity plea, he visited the client in the mental hospital, and the client laughed that he had fooled them all and had murdered his intended victims. This was the 80s. There wasn't any recording, and so try as he might, my dad could do nothing due to there being no new facts in the case. Double jeopardy. That was in the early 80s. He never took on another criminal defense case again. Ended up having a 30-year career in real estate and estate law, then became a judge. If it makes you or him feel any better, that guy suffered if he spent an extended period of time in a state psych hospital. If you're not guilty due to insanity, you're almost guaranteed to live the rest of your life in psychiatric custody unless you can convince whoever is in charge of it you're fine to leave. That is not a defense that's accepted often at all or lightly, or it isn't anymore. And psychiatric custody is absolute hell from what I've heard. So yeah, he probably left more effed up than he went in if he actually left. Story 14. Heard about this one through a friend. X is a young college student who gets picked up for drunkenly swerving through the road and had destroyed upwards of $10,000 of government and private property. My friend is graced with the task to defend. He says it's going to be a quick one. Gets back the next day, and he tells me the police searched the kid's vehicle and found about 400 pages of documents and 6 folders of photographs. College student was bait for his parents and aunts and uncle to lure women back to their home where they could have a ritual orgy and a ritual burning of the body out in the middle of nowhere. They wouldn't keep any of the parts, but they had a very lengthy record of how many people they were burning. Those 400 pages, mind you, not every page is each victim. They liked to document how the intercourse was and what the bodies looked like when they burned. Apparently, the student was off to get these pages and photographs bound into a book that he was going to make himself at a photocopy store for the family's ritual, not sure of the number, anniversary. It isn't often that you hear about actual people who are worse than the kind of monsters they come up with in horror movies and games, but here you go. People like this make the monsters in Resident Evil 7 sound downright hospitable. This sounds like I'm making a joke, but I'm not. Actual people are worse than what people making horror come up with. Story 15. Not an attorney, but a story from an attorney. I had a family member who committed murder, a pretty terrible double murder in the presence of a child. I had to testify against the family member, which meant I had to spend a lot of time with the defense also. The attorney knew the family member was guilty, but God, he was going to mount the best defense possible, and he did. Years later, I ran into that attorney, and he told me, the very first time I sat down with X, he looked me right in the eye and told me things I can't tell you. But I have been a PD for over 20 years, and X scared me the worst in the first 5 minutes of our meeting than any other client ever had before or since. I know that X told the lawyer that he should have taken out the little B kid that witnessed, and he told him how he should have done it, and for the sake of everyone, I won't share that. But yeah, in 5 minutes he knew X was a monster and that he still gave him one hell of a defense. Hated him for it, but respected him doing his job. The lawyer did, however, not represent in any of his appeals. Story 16. Have mostly avoided criminal defense, but not family law. Worst was the surgeon with narcissistic personality disorder and a drinking problem divorcing a public official with a serious drinking problem and a few personality disorders, who'd been bed-hopping with state-level politicians just before a statewide election. They reached an agreement, then he effed it up. Neither of them had any self-control. They would drunk text each other in the middle of the night, and he'd start screaming at me at 7:30 a.m. Her loyal would file emergency motions about whatever it was by noon. Months after we parted ways, he wrote me to demand all of my fees back. I wanted to write back and ask him how often he refunded fees when he successfully removed a patient's appendix, and they went home and blew out their own brains, but didn't. A distant second was the near octogenarian who was getting older ladies hooked on M and getting them to help him move it in his old pickup truck. He gave me the creeps. A judge friend of mine once told me, remember, the enemy is the client. Best piece of advice I've gotten in these 20 years. Story 17. Former juvenile court attorney and was listening to this case. I was not involved, so no RPC issue. Two minors, both male, had decided to rob a pizza delivery guy, so they called for a delivery pizza to an empty apartment building. The delivery guy arrived and was subsequently robbed, something like a large pie, his phone, and a 2-liter. The minors then decided they wanted to take the delivery guy's car, so they take his keys. While one is trying to start the car, the other decides to assault the delivery guy. Turns out the delivery guy's car was a manual/stick shift and the minors have no idea how to drive it. Instead of ending their crime spree, they then kidnap the driver and then force him to drive to their other friend's house across town. Once there, the same minor from earlier assault the pizza delivery driver again, then they beat up the driver and ran off. Driver makes it into a local shop down the road where he calls police. Adult offenders don't really bother me, but minors, their brains are not fully developed enough to understand the weight of their actions. Kids can be monsters. I mean, yeah, they don't fully understand, but that doesn't mean they aren't accountable. And it's heartbreaking, because a lot of that can come about from issues of abuse and neglect at home, so part of you wants to feel bad for whatever led them to being like that, but they are still totally accountable. Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day. Story 18. I saw this play out in court. Plaintiff was a prison guard who was pressured/forced to have intercourse/oral intercourse with her boss, the warden, on a number of occasions. The warden threatened to have her fired and blackballed if she refused or blew the whistle. After this carried on for a long while, she quit and filed a lawsuit, but unfortunately her idiot lawyer didn't timely file with the correct authorities. At the end of the day, her claim was barred and the warden enjoyed sovereign immunity. At the hearing, you could see the judge asking the prison guard questions to see if there was a workaround or some way for her complaint to survive the pending motion to dismiss, but there wasn't. That was hard to watch. It was even worse when the prison guard began to quietly cry. Fortunately, the warden wasn't at the hearing, and the attorney representing the state was professional and just focused on the legal arguments. He dipped out of the hearing in a hurry. Story 19. Not a lawyer, but I worked in a federal prison. Several inmates come to mind, but the one I'll tell about is a former Catholic priest. He'd given up his vacation years before, but he got caught up in a CP sting. At that time, sentencing was based on how many images a suspect had. He had thousands and was facing a maximum of 40 years. The guy was in his 50s, so that would have been essentially a genuine life sentence since federal inmates can only earn 15% good time. At his sentencing hearing, and I read this transcript so I know this is a fact, he told the judge when he was a priest he'd molested hundreds of young boys. Despite treatment and his own remorse, he felt completely incapable of stopping his obsession with CP and with molestation. He had not ever been charged with these crimes, but he felt guilty enough to admit them and then asked the judge to impose the full penalty so he'd be locked up for the rest of his life. Story 20. A friend of mine was serving detective for a British police force. He was tasked with investigating another officer of a higher rank to him in relation to having relations with underage boys. He said that there was always something fishy about this officer, but he couldn't put his finger on it until they got him into an interview room and he turned into a creepy pedophile right in front of them. At this point, it was all allegations and behaviors, so he was released on bail, but they put an undercover officer on him straight away. Pretty lucky, really, as within 30 minutes he had took himself to a local park and was photographing kids playing. That was the evidence they needed to hold him. During a search, they found his computer under some floorboards in his house with decades of indecent pics on it, and thankfully he is now serving a lengthy prison term. Absolute creep. Story 21. Client stabbed a guy in the neck because voices told him he was a god and that Latinos like him were gods. He went crazy on the phone saying how people don't understand him, implying that he would stab people who don't agree with him. He was getting out on a plea deal after serving less than 2 years. I was helping him with a medical lawsuit. Crap like that makes me very angry. I also have defended murderers, but they are usually polite to me. Defend a guy who I found out later shot his daughter's cheating boyfriend. Lured him into the shed to help lift some wood, then shot the guy in the back. Pretty effed up. Cheating boyfriend ended up burning himself nearly to death after surviving the shooting. Defended a domestic abuser who took no responsibility. Only people I refuse to defend? Child molesters. Can't do it, and I don't want to recuse myself from too many cases or I wouldn't have a job, so that's my line in the sand. Also, I could write a book on obnoxious, ungrateful, childish clients, but that'd take forever. I can at least respect that you have a line and that is where you draw it. Frankly, I just don't think I could defend any clients I genuinely felt were guilty, which is one of, admittedly, many reasons I could never be a lawyer. Story 22. I spent my career in property law. By and large, I would say that in civil law, you don't meet monsters so much as realize that the real monster is often the whole way the law or even society in general works. Very early on as a trainee doing a stint in employment law, I remember attending a meeting with a senior guy at some company that ran nursing homes that was a client of the firm. Naturally, they employed loads of poorly paid, often female staff, and the main thing they were interested in was making sure that the workforce didn't get unionized and that the company didn't have to recognize unions. They did not want to have to pay their staff more or improve their conditions. Not illegal, of course, and the people involved weren't personally evil, but it was a classic case of come see the violence inherent in the system. To do what they were doing required them to be bad guys. Story 23. Leo. My worst is those who target the most vulnerable. There's a particular thought process that goes into that. It's dark and predatory on another level. A well-known burglar would sneak into houses at night, tie up, and subsequently beat old people. He didn't even need to. They were no threat, and most never woke up. But he'd wake them up and then tie them up. Or another guy we got recently who only molested children with disabilities. He had access to loads of kids, but he only targeted kids with disabilities. The worst, though, was the guy who molested his 12-week-old. I cried after that shift. It was that tough. Dealing with both him and the baby was super tough. He was a real monster, a real horrible F. You could tell he got off on the whole thing and smiled the whole time. He also loved that it clearly had annoyed us and made us mad. Some people are barely human. Story 24. Not exactly a lawyer, and the client wasn't exactly a monster, but here is the closest experience I have. I was volunteering at a court-free family law assistance program. I helped people fill out family law court forms. When one of the clients straight up asked us how to hide money from her husband she wanted to divorce. This is illegal to do during a divorce proceeding, and I told her if she does that, she risks losing every dime of her money to her husband. She didn't want to hear that and kept trying to ask if there was a way to hide the money regardless. I got one of the actual attorneys in the clinic in hopes they could make the woman listen to reason. She was in the lawyer's office for a while, but I don't think she ever actually listened to our statements telling her not to do it. I mean, I don't know all the details. Maybe the husband is a monster and she wants a safety net of money for when she leaves or something. Who knows? But listen to lawyers and legal experts. Story 25. Criminal defense paralegal here. I've got stories for days, but the one that comes to mind is from a client that had been accused of R-ing his daughters, both who were under the age of 10 at the time. He had gotten a psychosexual evaluation from a nearby counseling office per our request, and the results were sent to our office about a week later. Most of the testing questions were centered around what the client personally found to be the most intimately appealing. And predictably, all of his answers revolved around young children in extremely intimate situations. This guy spared no details. There were also questions in which a certain hypothetical situation would be given, and the client had to place it somewhere on the spectrum between not intimately arousing, very intimately arousing, or anywhere in between. Every single hypothetical that he considered to be very intimately arousing had to do with children, or just generally taking advantage of whoever the target was. Needless to say, being alone with this client gave me the creeps. Blech. Story 26. Not a lawyer, but there's an infamous case in Australia where I'd want to know what the defense lawyer thought of it all. His name was Bilal Scoff, and he was a ringleader in the Gang R of 6 known teenage girls, ranging from him and 6 other guys to him and 14 other guys. There were times where they left the girls for dead after hosing them down and leaving them soaked to freeze in winter. This all happened, I think, in 2000 or 2001. His original sentence was appealed, and he got less time. The evidence was damning, and I'd like to know how the lawyer felt defending him. P.S. His brother was also a part of it and reached his end of non-parole sentence, but when he applied for parole, he was denied, and he still claims it wasn't really his fault or that it was R, instead claiming the girls were at fault / asking for it. Story 27. I had a professor in college who was a defense lawyer prior to being a professor. He told us the reason why he decided to stop defending people. He had a client who was accused of R-ing a teenage girl. From what I remember from his story, there was no DNA evidence to point to the client. The client was adamant to my professor that he was completely innocent. My professor argued in court at the trial and was successful in defending his client and got him acquitted. After everything was all said and done, he and his client went out to dinner to celebrate the victory. My professor said they were talking about some random topic when the man picked up his drink, said, "You know," he then took a sip and said, "I think she liked it." My professor recalled that the smirk on the guy's face made him want to vomit. I can't blame your professor for quitting defending after finding that out. To suddenly realize you helped a complete monster get away with such a disgusting crime, how do you live with knowing that? I know your professor had reason to believe him and shouldn't blame himself, but still, that would haunt me every day of my life. Story 28. Basically, he was watching his neighbor through the window in various stages of undress, got worked up. Minutes later, the victim showed up at his shop to purchase some food. She was alone, he closed the door behind her, and yeah, well, that's it. Prick got 25 years for that. That girl was 7 effing years old. You have no idea how often in our country the mentality of, well, if I'm worked up and there's a possibility of release close by, regardless of whom or what age or consenting or not, that's possibility is or might be, I'm entitled to take it, surfaces. Welcome to South Africa. The adverts on TV showing Table Mountain and the ocean is a load of crap. 47 violent murders every day. 1 in 3 of every woman killed is murdered by her own spouse or partner. Story 29. Not a lawyer, but worked for a law firm as an investigator. One of our clients stabbed an ex-lover multiple times over $100. Perp then ran out of the house all bloody. Neighbor and her teenage daughter see him covered in blood and rush inside to see if they can help while they call 911. Victim is still alive. On the 911 call the daughter made, you can hear the mom singing Amazing Grace while she tried to stop the bleeding. You can also hear the victim with a stab wound in her neck gurgling on blood while she tries to sing along. The EMTs arrived in under 3 minutes, but it took the police 19 minutes from the call to show up to clear the scene for them. She lived for 17 minutes. I saw the photos of the scene with the body still in place. It looked like a scene straight from Dexter. Story 30. Late to the party, but anyways. My first internship in law school was at a matrimonial law firm in a very wealthy area. Think millionaires and billionaires getting divorced. One of the first cases I worked on involved the parents of a victim of a high-profile school shooting. The parents were divorced and had been prior to the death of the child and were now battling over who would get the victim's compensation fund money and the funds they received from a fundraiser they set up themselves on a GoFundMe-type site. These were incredibly wealthy people fighting over what was literally chump change to them and asking the public to donate to them as if they needed it. They were so clearly exploiting the death of their child for money and to pee off the other parent. It was honestly one of the most disturbing things I have encountered ever. I mean, you really can't compare this crap to some of the other horrors that we've seen this video, but this is just awful to hear. Like, how do these people even have friends? If I knew someone who was doing something like that, I would cut all ties with them. Story 31. My friend got roughed up by campus security and detained illegally by them. He didn't just sue the campus, but had a personal suit against the guard and threatened to make it as messy and public as possible. Crap scared, the campus offered to fire the guard if he dropped the suit. He proceeded to push his lawyer to take the longest, most painfully drawn-out proceedings he could to have the 55-year-old guard fired and lose his pension, or have the university get dragged through the mud by every civil liberty groups in the country. The university blinked at this and let the guard take all the crap. As an added bonus, he made sure the guard got full notice of all of this on the 19th of December. Story 32. I had a client who was accused of domestic violence. Essentially, he threw his girlfriend out of a second-story window. Now, he's got a terrible history, but so do a lot of my clients, and his attitude is a little entitled, also typical. But he also knows the deal and wants a plea deal. So I'm not really prepared when he absolutely refuses the no jail offer from the state. Keep in mind, there were like 5 witnesses. Why? Because they wanted him to pay for her medical bills. Okay, an a-hole, but whatever, not the worst. What did it was his counteroffer. I ain't paying that bee's bills. Tell them I'll pay for the window. Prosecutor was not happy. Story 33. Oh, I can share a good story. I had a teacher in high school who was a former lawyer. We always asked him why he gave up his practice to start teaching. He finally caved and explained that his last case was the defense of 3 people. Apparently, there had been a 4th. It was 2 couples who, in the act of a drunken, drugged-out orgy, decided to kill, partially eat, and dismember one of the women. I guess it seemed like a good idea at the time. As a lawyer, he said it was pretty open and shut, but he had to get his clients the best results possible, and he was exposed to all the horrid details, the pictures, and their reasoning. My teacher had such a far-off look when he explained it that we could see it really got to him. Story 34. Not a lawyer, but I've been a court reporter for a good 10 years now. I also do police interviews. One recent one when I listened to the guy describing pimping out his young daughter online and laughing about how easy it was, how he was doing it as a favor for her, that she liked it in the end. They brought down a ring, including a pastor. It was a day where I was super glad to cuddle my puppy when the going got tough. Luckily, my job has a lot of WTF funny moments. It makes up for the tragic. Story 35. Years ago, I worked as a criminal defense lawyer. The lawyers I worked for were very selective of the cases they took on. They did have murder cases, drug trafficking, assault, and so on. Mostly I felt sorry for those people and their families. There was one woman, though, that was evil. She tried to hire a hitman to kill her son-in-law. Just looking at her and without knowing what she did, she sets off the vibe of a manipulative control freak. Watch out for overbearing mother-in-laws. First off, mothers-in-law, not mother-in-laws. Second, I'm sure there must have been plenty of other evil clients. I feel like you just wanted to make a fairly tired mother-in-law joke. Still, hiring a hitman is pretty intense. Story 36. I could have got my client off on a technicality. He was already serving 10 years for armed robbery when another case came up of gang R. I went to check the case file and saw they had made a muck of gathering evidence and blood samples. The detective said he was just going to archives and pointedly left the file out. I read the woman's account of her 14 known assailants from her home village, including my client. I dropped the case then and there. He died in a gang initiation in prison shortly afterwards, but he was apparently one of the kingpins. Sometimes you have to know when to fold them. Story 37. I was a juror on a case. We had to listen to secret tapes of the defendant arranging the murders of all the witnesses. The defense attorney had to act as if the defendant was trying to create his own sting to bring down a hitman. All of the remaining witnesses that testified had recently been in accidents or had forgotten everything. I wonder how that defense lawyer could take him seriously. Story 38. My mom is a lawyer and always refuses to defend the really disturbing clients, like the woman who wanted to get custody of her son at all costs, but as soon as she had another kid with another guy, she called my mom and said, "Never mind, I have a new child now," or something like that. Or the woman whose daughter accused the woman's boyfriend of R and said woman walks up to my mom and introduces the daughter by saying, "This is my W daughter." Story 39. When I had to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office to view the evidence in his case. There they were, the hundreds of images of CP he had traded, the close-up images of his baby's genitals that he had taken and sent around the internet, the pictures of his neighbor's daughters playing in their kiddie pool. Realized he just could not help himself, but he also never once claimed responsibility or showed remorse, so I don't feel too badly for him. Story 40. We had a client try and enforce a post-employment restraint against a 19-year-old receptionist after she quit and started working for a competitor. The reason? He wanted to make her life hell because she wouldn't sleep with him, a creepy 57-year-old man. Him trying to sleep with her was the reason she quit. Unsurprisingly, he didn't take our advice to discontinue his claim, and so we ended up sending him elsewhere. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.